My son was battling for his life in the ICU when my own family siphoned $850,000 from my account. My brother-in-law sneered and said, "We needed it more than you." I could hardly breathe, but they had no clue what was about to happen. And then boom, the front door burst open. And, can you imagine anything worse than this? Your 8-year-old son is clinging to life in the ICU, hooked up to every machine imaginable, and while you're praying for a miracle, your own family drains every single penny you've saved for his care. All $850,000. And when I confronted them, my brother-in-law just stared me down, a smug smirk on his face, and said, "We needed it more than you." They laughed, completely untouchable. But they had no idea what was coming for them. Before we dive into how their world came crashing down, I've got a quick question. What time are you listening to this, and where are you right now? Drop a comment below. I promise you'll want to hear how this ends. I've been stuck in this hard plastic chair outside the ICU for what felt like an eternity, just staring at the floor, like it might hold some secret answer. The air was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic, and the steady, relentless beeping of machines behind that closed door was marking time in a way that just made my chest ache. My son, Eli, he's in there. Just 8 years old, and hooked up to more tubes than I could even count. I'm a 39-year-old single dad, running my own small design business. But in that moment, none of that mattered. The only thing I cared about was Eli. That he kept breathing, kept fighting. These last 2 weeks had blurred into a nightmare of sleepless nights and whispered prayers. Every dollar I'd saved over the last decade, every late night, every client I'd bent over backward for, it was all for him. I told myself it was our safety net. That no matter what else life threw at us, at least we'd be okay financially. That belief was the only thing keeping me upright as I paced that endless hallway. At some point, almost on autopilot, I pulled out my phone. I don't even remember why. Maybe habit. Maybe I just needed to reassure myself that when the next hospital bill came, I could handle it. The banking app opened. I blinked once. Then twice. My stomach dropped like a stone. My checking account, $0. Savings, $0. Business account, also $0. For a split second, my brain just refused to process it. This had to be a mistake. I refreshed. I tried another card. Same thing. My hands started to tremble, a cold dread spreading through me. The walls felt like they were closing in. My pulse was so loud in my ears, I almost didn't hear the nurse calling someone's name down the hall. I forced myself to dial the bank, my voice barely steady as I gave them my information. The woman on the other end sounded so calm, so utterly dispassionate, like she wasn't telling me my entire life had just been erased. "Yes, sir. I see several transfers overnight. They were authorized from a recognized device linked to your account." "No," I choked out, my voice cracking. "That's not possible. I understand this is difficult." She interrupted, her tone carefully measured. "But the security questions were answered correctly. The transfers were made between 11:40 p.m. and 4 a.m. It felt like a punch to the gut. Someone had gone into my accounts. Someone who knew everything about me. And they had taken everything. I hung up without even saying goodbye, my hands so unsteady I nearly dropped the phone. By the time I left the hospital, the sky had gone dark. The cool night air of Portland bit at my skin, but I barely felt it. I drove on autopilot, my mind a storm of disbelief and dread, until the lake house came into view. That place was supposed to be a refuge, where my family gathered for barbecues and summer weekends. Tonight, it felt like enemy territory. I didn't knock. I just pushed the door open, my footsteps loud against the old wooden floor. The laughter coming from the living room died instantly. Gideon was sprawled on the couch, a whiskey glass dangling from his hand like he owned the place. Serena sat next to him, my own sister, her eyes darting between me and the floor, her body shrinking in on itself. "Where is it?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended, laced with a tremor I couldn't hide. Gideon's lips curled into that smug, condescending smile I'd hated since the day I met him. "Well, hello to you, too." I took a step closer, my fists clenching at my sides, my whole body vibrating with a controlled fury. "Don't play games with me. My accounts are empty. All of them. Where's my money?" He leaned back, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his drink before answering. "We needed it more than you." The words landed like a physical slap. My ears rang, and for a moment, I couldn't even process what he just said. "Excuse me?" I managed to choke out, my throat tight. Serena finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't make this about you." I laughed, but it came out hollow, devoid of humor. "Don't make this about me? $850,000. My son is in the ICU fighting for his life, and you drain me dry. How is this not about me?" Gideon shrugged, as if the conversation bored him, as if I was just a minor inconvenience. "You'll figure it out. You always do." The rage simmering inside me threatened to spill over, to consume everything, but I swallowed it down. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. My world was burning, and they sat there in their comfortable little bubble, sipping whiskey like they hadn't just destroyed everything I had. I took a deep, shaky breath, forcing my voice to steady. "Then you won't mind what's coming next?" They exchanged a glance, then Gideon let out a short, dismissive laugh. Serena gave a little chuckle, too, as if I was some pathetic joke they'd already heard before. Smug. Untouchable. But then I saw it. Just for a second, a flicker of something in Gideon's eyes. A crack in his mask. I stepped back onto the porch, the night air pressing against me like a physical weight. Their laughter from inside was still echoing in my head, hollow and sharp. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text from Serena. "Don't make this about you. We're all struggling." I reread it twice, my thumb hovering over the screen as if I could erase the words by sheer will. My son was lying in a hospital bed, machines breathing for him, and she had the audacity to send me that? My throat tightened. For a moment, I considered leaving, just walking away and letting them have their little charade. But I knew what that would mean. They'd win. They'd paint me as the unstable one, the bitter sibling who couldn't handle her own failures. I stood there, staring at the glow from the windows, and reminded myself, this wasn't about them. This was about Eli. About every hour I'd worked to make sure we'd be okay. By the time I walked back in, the lake house had transformed. The living room chaos was replaced with the quiet hum of a family dinner. I stepped into the dining room and it felt like I'd stumbled into someone else's life. The table was set for 12, every plate and glass meticulously arranged. The smell of roasted meat and herbs filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of expensive wine. Everyone else looked relaxed, laughing, exchanging pleasantries like this was any other night. But when they saw me, the room shifted. Eyes flicked my way, then just as quickly turned back to their conversations. No one offered me a seat, or even acknowledged I'd come back. I found my spot at the far end of the table, as far away from the laughter as possible, tucked in the shadow of Gideon's spotlight. He sat at the head, his arm draped casually over Serena's chair, basking in the attention like he was the benevolent host. I barely tasted the food. My fork scraped against the plate in slow, deliberate movements as I tried to focus on anything but the smirk across the table. My mind kept drifting back to Eli, his pale face, the beep of the monitors, and then to the terrifying 0 on my bank screen. I couldn't understand how any of them could eat so comfortably, knowing what they'd done. Halfway through the meal, Gideon decided to speak. "You know," he said, raising his glass as if delivering some profound insight, "some people just aren't cut out for managing money." His voice carried through the room, dripping with fake sympathy. "It's sad, really." A few people chuckled nervously. No one dared to meet my eyes. Serena stared at her plate, her fingers tapping lightly against the stem of her wine glass. No defense, no apology. Just silence. My stomach turned, and I set my fork down with a clatter. I wanted to shout, to lay every bit of their betrayal bare for the whole room. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, cataloging every word, every look. Let them think they'd humiliated me. Let them think I was beaten. As the evening dragged on, I studied them. How Gideon used his words like weapons, subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but sharp enough to wound. How Serena leaned into his protection, hiding behind his cruelty like it excused her complicity. And how everyone else avoided me altogether, choosing the comfort of their ignorance over the discomfort of truth. I stayed quiet. My silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Every insult, every cold glance was fuel. They'd taken my money, my dignity, and tried to strip me of my worth. But they couldn't take my resolve. By the time dessert was served, I wasn't the same person who'd walked through that door. I wasn't just the grieving sister or the desperate parent clinging to hope. I was someone who'd been pushed to the edge, and decided she wasn't going to fall. But they weren't done humiliating me. Not by a long shot. I lingered in the hallway longer than I should have, letting their voices fade into the hum of crickets outside. The laughter at that table was still echoing in my head, clashing with the image of Eli in that hospital bed. My hands felt cold, my fingers stiff around the phone I hadn't managed to put down since Serena's text. After a few deep breaths, I forced myself back into the dining room. That's when I noticed it. My seat had been moved. I had been at the far end before, but now I was practically next to the kitchen door, in a spot where servers would brush by with plates. A clear message that I didn't deserve to sit among them. Someone had deliberately done it, and they wanted me to notice. I stood there a moment, taking in the picture-perfect scene, candles burning low, crystal glasses catching the light, and at the opposite end, Gideon leaning back in his chair, completely at ease. He didn't even glance up at me. Every scrape of a fork against china, every muffled giggle from the other end, felt choreographed. I'd never felt so visible and invisible all at once. They didn't need to shout or point fingers. This was more cutting than any screaming match. It was a quiet, calculated humiliation that told me exactly where I stood, outside of them. I slid into my new spot without a word, the chair creaking as I pulled it in. My hands itched to grab my bag and leave, but I stayed. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was because I knew walking out would be exactly what they wanted. Then I saw it. A familiar glint caught my eye, reflecting the low light from the chandelier. Gideon raised his arm as he gestured to someone across the table. And there it was, on his wrist. My father's watch. For a second, I couldn't breathe. That Omega watch wasn't just some accessory. It had been my father's. The one he'd worn to every meaningful occasion. The one he'd handed to me 2 days before he passed away. I could still hear him saying, "This stays with you. It's part of you now." And here it was, on Gideon. I gripped the napkin in my lap so tightly that the fabric twisted in my hands. He tapped the face of the watch as he laughed at something one of my uncles said, like he knew exactly what he was doing, like he wanted me to see it. Through the blur of conversations and clinking glasses, my pulse roared in my ears. I replayed that moment in the hospital when my father's hand, frail and cool, pressed that watch into mine. How could Gideon have it now? The dinner dragged on in a haze. I didn't taste the food. I barely heard the small talk. All I could focus on was that watch and the dull, suffocating ache in my chest. When dessert was served, I stood abruptly, muttering something about needing air. My feet carried me to the hallway where the buzz of voices dulled. I didn't wait long. Serena slipped out a few minutes later, her heels clicking softly on the wooden floor. "Why does he have Dad's watch?" My voice was low, but it came out sharper than I intended. She stopped mid-step, but she didn't turn to face me. "It's just a watch," she said quietly. Too quickly. "No," I said, stepping closer. "Don't do that. Dad gave it to me. He told me it was mine. So tell me why your husband is wearing it like some trophy." She glanced back, her expression unreadable. "You always make things so difficult," she whispered. "It's just sharing the family legacy. You need to let things go. Let it go." I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. First the money, and now this. "Do you hear yourself?" She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly small, like she was retreating into his shadow even when he wasn't there. Please, just don't start something tonight. Not here. Her words weren't a defense. They were a dismissal, a plea for me to stay quiet so everyone else could keep their illusion of harmony intact. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. I walked back to the guest room, the one they'd stuck me in at the farthest corner of the house, and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were still trembling, but now it wasn't from shock. It was rage, pure, cold, and simmering just under the surface. My father was gone, my savings were stolen, and my own sister had chosen to stand by while her husband paraded around in something that was never his. That night, I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. I thought about Eli, about my father, about how easily they'd erased me from everything that mattered. And I made myself a promise. I wouldn't let them erase me. Not as a daughter, not as a parent, not as anything. But the watch wasn't the only thing they'd stolen from me. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Gideon's wrist with my father's watch gleaming like a taunt. Serena's carefully blank face when I confronted her. The way they had made me feel like I didn't belong in a house my father had built. I lay there, feeling as though the walls of that guest room were closing in on me. Around midnight, I gave up trying to sleep. The house was utterly still, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator somewhere in the distance. I got up and padded barefoot into the hallway, careful not to make the old wood creak. I'd spent countless holidays in this place, Christmas mornings in pajamas, summer barbecues with my father on the porch. But now those memories felt like they belonged to someone else's life. I found myself drifting toward the study. My father had always kept his most important papers in there. Even after his passing, Serena insisted the room be left as is, but something about it tonight felt altered. When I opened the door, the familiar smell of old leather and dust hit me, but the room didn't look right. The desk drawers weren't as neat as I remembered. Folders that should have been aligned perfectly were slightly ajar, some stacked awkwardly. I flicked on the small desk lamp, its yellow glow making the shadows dance across the walls, and started pulling things out. It was aimless at first, looking for what, I didn't even know. But as my fingers grazed the edge of a large envelope tucked beneath some tax documents, I felt my pulse quicken. My name was on it, written in my father's unmistakable hand. I slid it open, my fingers shaking slightly. Inside were estate documents. Updated ones. At first, I thought my tired brain was misreading them. But no, the words were clear. The notarization dates staring back at me like an accusation. My father's original will had ensured I received a share of the lake house along with part of his business assets. He told me himself. But these papers stripped me of nearly everything. Key properties, liquid assets, even parts of the family business. Quietly reassigned, all in Serena and Gideon's names. My throat tightened, and I had to sit down before my knees gave out. I read through each page, my heart pounding louder with every line. The dates were months after my father's funeral. It didn't make sense. He couldn't have signed these. He was gone. The realization sank in like a stone in water. They hadn't just taken my savings. They'd taken my inheritance. They had tampered with the one thing my father had left to ensure I'd be okay. I wanted to scream, to wake them up and demand answers. But the house was silent. And in that silence, I felt something else settling over me. Fury, yes, but also a terrifying clarity. They thought I wouldn't find this. They thought I wouldn't fight back. I sat there for what felt like hours, the papers spread out on the desk, my fingers tracing my father's signature. Whether real or forged, I didn't know yet. My chest ached, but my mind was sharp, clearer than it had been in days. They've taken everything, I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible in the heavy stillness. But they don't know me as well as they think. I gathered the documents carefully, folding them back into the envelope. As I turned off the lamp and stepped back into the dark hallway, I felt a shift inside me. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about erasure, about them rewriting the story of my family without me in it. and they weren't going to get away with it. And then, as if to grind me further into the ground, Gideon made his boldest move yet. The morning came heavy and gray, as if the weather itself understood what was waiting for me. I barely slept. By the time I walked into the living room, Gideon had already staged his scene. Relatives I hadn't seen in months were gathered on the couches, some perched awkwardly on the armrests. Gideon stood in the middle like a master of ceremonies, a manila envelope in his hand. That same smug curve on his mouth. "Glad you're here," he said, his voice syrupy sweet and loud enough for everyone to hear. "We were just about to clear the air." My stomach nodded. I didn't like his tone. Didn't like the way Serena stood behind him, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the carpet as if she wanted to disappear. He opened the envelope with theatrical slowness, like a man about to unveil a great truth. "You've been saying I took your money," he said, glancing at me. "But here's the thing. That's not how it happened." I didn't respond. I couldn't. He held up a document, flipping it toward the room. "You all should know," he announced. "She voluntarily entrusted me with $850,000. It was a loan for a family investment." My heart slammed against my ribs. He walked toward me, waving the papers. "Your signature is right here." And there it was. My name. My handwriting. Or what could pass for it, perfect enough to almost convince me I had signed it during some forgotten, sleep-deprived night. Gasps filled the room. A few aunts leaned closer to get a better look. One of my cousins murmured something about how it makes sense now. "See," Gideon said, his voice dripping with false benevolence. "You're making me out to be a thief, but I've only been holding what you gave me, for us." For us, as if this had ever been for anyone but him. My knees felt weak. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. How could I argue with a paper that said otherwise? How could I defend myself when my own family already looked at me like I'd lost my mind? I scanned the room, searching for someone, anyone, to back me up. Serena wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared at the floor like a child caught in a lie. And that told me everything I needed to know. "You forged that," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. Gideon chuckled, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Of course you'd say that. That's what people do when they regret their decisions. They rewrite history." The room shrank around me. I could feel their judgment like a weight pressing into my chest. A few relatives exchanged wary looks, and I knew what they were thinking. Maybe she really is unstable. Maybe Gideon is telling the truth. I wanted to scream, to rip the papers from his hands and set them on fire, but I didn't. I couldn't. My throat closed around the words. I felt small, voiceless. By the time I walked out of that house, I didn't even remember saying goodbye. Hours later, I was in my car, parked outside the ICU. I don't remember the drive. I just remember staring at the dashboard, numb. My son was inside, still fighting for his life. Tubes and machines doing what his little body couldn't. And here I was, stripped of everything, my money, my dignity, even my place in my own family story. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for my tears to dry on my cheeks, for my breathing to slow to that hollow rhythm of defeat. My gaze drifted to the passenger seat. Eli's stuffed blue bear was slumped there, its fur worn from years of bedtime hugs. I picked it up, pressing it to my chest. And in that small, familiar weight, I felt my resolve spark again. "If I give up," I whispered to no one, "what does that make me for him?" I couldn't let them win. Not like this. And then a single, unexpected voice gave me the first glimmer of hope. That voice came just when I'd stopped expecting to hear anything good. It was late evening. The ICU waiting room cast in that eerie glow of fluorescent lights, with the constant hum of machines somewhere beyond the double doors. I had been sitting there for hours, head in my hands, numb from everything: Gideon's false papers, my family's silence, Eli's fragile little body fighting behind a closed door. Time in that place didn't move. It pressed on you like a weight. Dull and relentless. My mind couldn't let go of Gideon's face. That smirk. Those forged signatures that looked so real I'd almost believe them myself. I kept replaying the scene in the living room over and over, each time thinking of a sharper comeback, a way to make them hear me. But every imagined response fell flat because in the real world, he'd walked away with everyone's sympathy and my life in his hands. I didn't notice Marcy until she was sitting right beside me. "Hey," she said softly, like she wasn't sure I'd even want to hear her voice. I blinked at her, disoriented. Marcy was my cousin, the one who always stayed out of family drama, the one who smiled at holidays and avoided anything resembling conflict. She wasn't supposed to be here. "I couldn't just sit with it," she said quickly, her eyes darting toward the hallway as if making sure no one else followed her. "I had to tell you what I know." "What do you mean?" My voice came out hoarse, like I hadn't spoken in days. She twisted her hands in her lap. "Gideon, he likes to drink late at night. Whiskey, usually. And when he does, he talks too much." Something in my chest tightened. "Marcy," I said carefully, "what are you trying to tell me?" She took a deep breath. "I overheard him bragging about you. About the money." My pulse quickened. "Bragging about what, exactly?" She leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "He said he drained your accounts. Said he forged the papers so no one would ever believe you. He laughed about it. Said you'd handed him the rope to hang you with. His words, not mine." The room tilted for a second. I gripped the edge of my chair, trying to ground myself. "And," Marcy added, pulling out her phone with shaking hands, "I recorded part of it. I didn't know what to do with it, but I couldn't stay quiet anymore." She slid the phone across to me. My fingers felt clumsy as I pressed play. There it was. His voice. That lazy, arrogant drawl. "She's too naive to fight back. Signed everything like a good little mark." He laughed like ruining my life was some kind of sport. It was him. No question. I stared at the phone for a long moment before I looked at Marcy. "Why are you telling me this now?" Her eyes filled with something that looked like guilt. "Because I should have said something earlier. And because you need help. I know someone who can give it to you. An old college friend of mine, Drake. He's a legal investigator. He deals with people like Gideon for a living." For the first time in weeks, I felt air fill my lungs fully. A way forward. Marcy must have seen it on my face because she touched my arm lightly. "You don't have to do this alone." That single sentence hit harder than Gideon's lies ever could. I wasn't alone. By the time we left the hospital for a late-night diner, the heaviness had shifted. It was still there, sure, but under it, a new current ran. Cautious hope. Determination. We sat in a quiet booth, nursing bad coffee, while Marcy laid out what Drake could do: gather evidence, track financial trails, make all those family investments unravel in a courtroom where Gideon couldn't lie his way out. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, staring at the steam rising from it. "I'm done being their scapegoat," I said, more to myself than to her. "If Gideon wants a war, he'll get one." And for the first time since this nightmare began, I actually meant it. The first step, gathering enough evidence to bring their empire crashing down. It started with a choice. To stop surviving and start fighting. Sitting by Eli's bed again, feeling his little fingers curled around mine, I knew I couldn't afford another day of paralysis. His cheeks had more color than before. That small change lit something in me. Grief had sharpened me. Anger had given me purpose. They'd taken my money, my family name, even my father's legacy. But they weren't going to take my son's future. Marcy kept her word. 2 days later, she walked me into a co-working space downtown, a sleek room with glass walls and humming printers. That's where I met Drake. He was everything Gideon wasn't. Focused. Efficient. No time for theatrics. He shook my hand firmly, his dark eyes studying me like he was already taking inventory of my case. "Marcy filled me in," he said, his voice steady. "We can nail him, but we need airtight proof. Digital paper. And ideally, his own words." He paused. "That's how you win." For the first time in weeks, I heard someone talk about winning, not just surviving. He laid out the plan: retrieve a full record of logins and transactions tied to my stolen accounts, secure copies of the altered inheritance documents, and if I had the stomach for it, catch Gideon bragging on camera. "He'll slip," Drake assured me. "People like him always do." Over the next several days, I lived between the ICU, my apartment, and Drake's workspace. It became a routine. Mornings with Eli, afternoons with Drake, nights lying awake connecting dots. Watching Drake work was its own kind of education. He combed through my laptop, phone backups, even cloud accounts I hadn't accessed in months. One afternoon, he called me over. "Take a look at this." On his screen was a log. Dozens of unauthorized logins to my accounts, all within a tight window. "These were made from your devices," he said, pointing to the timestamps. "Except you weren't the one logging in. See the IP addresses? They match Gideon's home and the lake house." He didn't even bother covering his tracks. I stared at the screen, part of me furious at his arrogance, another part grateful for it. Every click he made, every file he pulled, pieced together the story of how Gideon bled me dry. But Drake wasn't done. "Now for the will," he said. I swallowed hard. That word still felt like a fresh wound. He explained how we'd plant a camera at the lake house. "You stage a visit," he told me. "Act like you're letting things go. Get him comfortable. And then let the whiskey do the rest." So I did. A week later, I drove back to that place, smiling when I wanted to scream, pretending to accept Serena's shallow apologies, letting Gideon believe I'd been broken into submission. I tucked the camera where Drake told me to. Every step rehearsed in my head until it felt like second nature. 2 days later, we sat in that glass-walled office watching the footage together. There was Gideon, leaning back in his chair, drink in hand, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction. "We rewrote history," he boasted to a cousin. "The will, the assets, all of it. Finally put that legacy in the right hands." "The right hands." Drake muted the video and looked at me. "That's it. That's your nail in the coffin." I sat there, silent for a moment, letting it sink in. He wasn't just careless. He was proud. Proud of gutting my father's last wishes. Proud of destroying me. My pulse steadied. My voice, when it came, was cold and clear. "They wanted war and silence. I'll give them justice in daylight." And soon, the entire family would watch Gideon's empire burn. The invitation went out 3 days before, written in my most neutral tone. "We need to end this fighting. Let's meet, all of us, at the lake house." I made it sound like I wanted peace, like I was finally ready to bury the hatchet. It was a performance, and I played it well. By the time I arrived that afternoon, the house buzzed with a low hum of uneasy conversation. Cars lined the gravel drive, and inside, aunts and cousins mingled, their voices hushed, but eager. Serena stood by the kitchen counter, twisting a napkin in her hands, avoiding my eyes. Gideon, of course, was in the center of it all. Whiskey in hand, relaxed, smirking like a man about to enjoy a victory lap. "Finally decided to talk like adults," he said when I stepped into the living room. His tone was sweet, but it dripped with condescension. I ignored the bait. "Let's sit." The family gathered in the main room, filling the long couches and chairs, some standing along the walls. I took the single armchair opposite Gideon, the weight of everyone's stares pressed on me. But I held my ground. "This isn't easy," I began, my voice calm but steady. "But we need to talk about what's been done to me, to my father's legacy, to my son." Gideon chuckled. "Oh, this again. You really need to let it go. We've all been through hard times." I didn't respond. Instead, I opened the laptop I'd placed on the coffee table. The room went still at the sight of it. "Before you dismiss me," I said, "you should hear this." I pressed play. Gideon's own voice filled the room. Drunken, brash, and damning. "We rewrote history," he boasted to his cousin. "The will, the assets, all of it. Finally put that legacy in the right hands." Gasps rippled through the room. A few aunts exchanged horrified glances. One uncle muttered a curse under his breath. Serena went pale, her napkin clutched so tightly I thought it might tear. You! Gideon started, his voice rising, but I raised my hand. I'm not finished. Drake's voice came next, crisp and measured through the speakerphone. I've conducted a forensic analysis of the financial records, he said. Every unauthorized transfer leads back to Gideon's devices and IP addresses. We also traced the timestamps of logins to your cloud accounts, all occurring in the early hours while you were documented elsewhere. I turned to Gideon. You said I gave you that money as a loan. Tell them why you were logging into my accounts at 3 a.m. Tell them why my father's will, which secured me my share of this house, was rewritten in your favor after his death. He shot up from his seat, his face red, his mouth moving faster than his brain. You're twisting things. You've always been unhinged. They all know it. But no one rushed to agree with him. The aunts stared at their laps. My uncles wouldn't meet his gaze. Even Serena's shoulders sagged like she'd finally given up holding his lies. You've stolen enough, I said, rising to my feet, my voice ringing with a conviction I hadn't felt in months. And today it ends. The timing was almost cinematic. The front door burst open with a thud, and uniformed officers swept inside, firm and deliberate. Gideon Price, the lead officer called out. You're under arrest for fraud, theft, and identity tampering. We have a warrant. Chaos erupted. Relatives jumped to their feet, some shouting, others crying. Gideon's bravado cracked, replaced by a frantic kind of sputtering as he tried to talk over the officer reading his rights. Serena's sobs broke through the noise as she covered her face with her hands. The cuffs clicked around his wrists. For the first time in months, I felt my lungs expand fully. He glared at me as they led him out, his voice shaking. You think this is over? You think. But the rest of his threats were drowned out by the slam of the door. Silence filled the room. Serena finally looked at me. Really looked at me, with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Gratitude, maybe, or shame. I didn't know. She whispered something I couldn't quite catch. I nodded but said nothing. The time for words had passed. I turned to the rest of the family. Their faces a mix of shock and relief. This wasn't just about money, I said quietly. This was about my father. About Eli. About every one of you who let this man take whatever he wanted because you were too afraid to call him out. No one spoke. I didn't need them to. As I walked out of that house, leaving the stunned silence behind me, one thought rang in my head like a bell. Gideon's empire had finally started to crumble. But justice in court would be nothing compared to the healing that came next. The weeks after the raid passed like moving through water, slow, heavy, but steady. Gideon's empire unraveled piece by piece. His smugness had been replaced by silence, his untouchable persona dismantled by handcuffs and court dates. I spent those weeks buried in paperwork, working with Drake, visiting Eli, and trying to remember what normal even felt like. Then, one rainy Thursday evening, there was a knock at my apartment door. I opened it to find Serena standing there. Not the Serena I'd known for years, perfectly composed, sharp-tongued, in Gideon's shadow, but a stripped-down version of her. No makeup, hair pulled into a limp ponytail, eyes red like she hadn't slept in days. She clutched her coat around her like armor, but it wasn't enough to shield her. Can I come in? She asked, voice so quiet, I almost didn't hear it over the patter of rain on the hallway window. I stepped aside, letting her into my small living room. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring at the floor like she needed to find the courage somewhere between the scuffed tiles. And then it came, the words tumbled out of her in fragments. I was scared, she said, her voice cracking. I let him control everything. He told me what to think, what to say. He made me believe I'd be nothing without him. And I let him turn me against you. The weight of it pressed against my chest. This was the sister I'd grown up with. The one I'd thought I'd lost long before Gideon drained my accounts or rewrote my father's will. Tears streaked down her face as she went on. I didn't just lose a husband, she said, collapsing into the armchair like her legs gave out. I lost myself, and I let him take you from me, too. I'm so sorry. I sat across from her, hands clasped tightly in my lap. My first instinct was anger. Anger for the silence, the complicity. The way she'd stood by him while I was humiliated in front of our family. But beneath it, sadness swirled. She wasn't just apologizing for Gideon. She was apologizing for every moment she hadn't been my sister when I needed her most. You could have stopped him, I said finally, my voice low. She nodded, her chin trembling. I know, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. For a long while either of us spoke. The rain kept tapping against the window like it was keeping time with our silence. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. I don't want any part of what he took, she said, pushing it toward me. My share of the estate. I've already signed it over. It's yours. It should have been yours all along. It was more than I expected, more than I thought she'd ever be willing to give. In the weeks that followed, Drake and I worked tirelessly to regain control of my accounts. With his help, the banks reversed fraudulent transfers, and the legal process began restoring what had been stolen. Not just my money, but my place in my father's legacy. Serena stayed involved, quietly signing over her portion of the tampered estate. She wanted nothing more to do with the house, the inheritance, or the remnants of Gideon's corruption. And then one crisp Saturday morning, I drove back to the lake house. It was different without him there. Quieter. Lighter. The walls no longer hummed with Gideon's control. Instead, they felt like mine again. I spent the day repainting. Scuffed baseboards, repairing broken hinges, restoring what had been neglected. Every brush stroke, every nail hammered in place felt like reclaiming a part of myself I'd thought was gone. Eli came with me, still recovering, but strong enough to explore. He wandered through the halls, his little feet echoing on the hardwood, stopping now and then to peek into rooms like he was meeting them for the first time. Before we left, I placed his blue bear, the one I'd seen in the car during my lowest moment, on the mantel in the living room. It looked small against the wide wooden shelf, but it meant everything. It wasn't just a toy. It was a reminder of why I'd fought, why I hadn't disappeared when despair almost swallowed me whole. As I stood there with Eli's hand in mine, sunlight streaming through the wide lake house windows, I felt the kind of peace I hadn't known in years. They tried to erase me, I whispered, not to anyone in particular. But I'm still here. And this time, no one takes from my family. Justice, I realized, doesn't always roar in courtrooms or make headlines. Sometimes it's quiet. A signed document restoring what's yours. A repaired door in a house once stolen. A sister weeping her regrets in your living room. Sometimes justice isn't loud. It's a blue bear on a mantel and a son's smile in the sunlight. Tell me, have you ever had to stand up to someone who thought they were untouchable? What did you do? Share your story in the comments below. I'd really love to hear it.